Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 4 wide receiver trade targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 6 wide receivers that you should be buying low. Prospects who have not performed up to their overall potential thus far this season that we should be investing in for the weeks ahead. Players that you may only have an opportunity of getting on your roster right now, because after this week, they may end up breaking out, having themselves big performances, and making their overall price in terms of trade value that much higher and inaccessible for us throughout the rest of the season. Now, besides talking about some potential buy low targets, we'll of course talk about some sell high prospects at the wide receiver position and the running back position who you may be able to move off your roster in order to gain some of the value. Now, last week we talked about our Week 3 running back trade targets. Specifically, some of the running backs that I mentioned on today's video in terms of sell high prospects could be used to go ahead and garner the value of the players that I mentioned last week. Now, before we get into today's content, I want to remind you guys, we are very close to reaching our goal of 70,000 subscribers. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, all the way till Week 18, for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So do yourself a favor, subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. Thank you very much. Also, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy and you're trying to participate in more weekly fantasy contests, perhaps you didn't, draft enough teams this offseason, or you don't have anybody playing in tonight's game. Again, Underdog Fantasy is the best way of going about that, whether it is competing in tonight's contest by drafting some players or going ahead and participating in the Pick'ems contest. As of tonight, my favorite Pick'ems are, as shown on screen right here. We have Joe Mixon lower in terms of overall yardage, rushing and receiving. We have Joe Burrow higher in terms of rushing total. And we have T. Higgins higher in terms of receiving yards, and Justin Fields to cap it off, because you need to have 2 teams in a singular slip to go ahead and have him on the lower in terms of total yardage. Now, the reason why I've gone ahead and indicated as such is because as of this current moment in time, I look at Joe Mixon. I know that he's coming off that ankle injury. I know that Samaje Perine is certainly going to get utilization out of this backfield and may end up dominating the receiving work. So if Joe Mixon is relegated to only the rushing attempts, this may be very difficult for him to be able to surpass this overall yardage count, which he hasn't been able to do since Week 1 when he was fully healthy and Samaje Perine himself wasn't getting that much receiving work in comparison. Now, when we look at a player like Joe Burrow, the times that he's been able to run for more than 12 rushing yards, it's typically been games where the pass rush is significant enough to force him out of the pocket. I believe this is another one of those circumstances where the Miami Dolphins, front 7, specifically their defensive line, are going to get after Joe Burrow and force him out of the pocket, which will force him to get these rushing yards with his legs. Following up with T. Higgins, in the last 15 games that he has played fully and healthy, including the NFL playoffs of last year, 11 of those 15 games have consisted of 70 or more receiving yards, continuing the trend of success. And we all know that Justin Fields has been struggling as of late, really not throwing the ball very much, and even when he is, very few completions. So for those of you who are interested in participating in tonight's Underdog Fantasy Pick'ems, go ahead, check that out. Go over down to the description of the video, click on the link. When you sign up today using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. So you can go ahead, draft some teams, make some pick'em slips, and win some money tonight. Check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about today's content, specifically the wide receiver trade targets, players that you should be going after, buying low before it's too late. And the first player that came to mind in regards to this is obviously Justin Jefferson. He's coming off of truly unfortunate performances in which he only put up 7.8 and 2.9 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. He really was shut down by Jeff Okudah last week, and the week prior, Darius Slay did cause a lot of trouble for him. But going forward, we're anticipating the wide receiver that we have seen in seasons past. The guy that last year alone in 2021 only had 2 performances of less than 10 points. He's already met that thus far this season. And going forward, I expect him to get back on track and for the entire Vikings organization to understand that they need to get him the ball on a consistent basis. I'm sure Kevin O'Connell knows that. He has said that in multiple interviews already as of the last week. And I'm sure Kirk Cousins knows that he needs to get the ball to his top receiving option, because that's what he's been able to do over the last 2 years with him. So going forward, we're expecting Justin Jefferson, who's still the number 8 overall wide receiver at this current moment in time, to have himself incredible performances to come. But if in fact you have the ability to go ahead and invest in Justin Jefferson, bring him onto your team because someone in your league is already frustrated with his performances and the fact that he's only been able to put up over 10 points in just the last 2 weeks combined, you may be able to strike gold and steal one of the most valuable fantasy prospects in the 2022 season for a very cheap overall price. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next player that I wanted to mention. It is Deebo Samuel. This is another player that I had in my top 12 wide receivers going into the 2022 season. And thus far this season, he's currently been the number 28 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, having put up 11.6, 12.2, and 10.4 fantasy points in each of the last 3 weeks. So if you go ahead and just look at his overall contributions in this offense in terms of rushing and receiving, it's very similar to what he was doing late last season when Deebo Samuel, the running back, was taking over. And the main reason that Deebo Samuel, the running back, even had an opportunity of being utilized at that capacity was when Elijah Mitchell went down with his injury. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we have not only seen Elijah Mitchell go down, Tyrion Davis-Price go down, but also Trey Lance. That's all of the rushing threat within this offense pretty much diminished. And yes, they still have Jeff Wilson Jr., but I 100% believe they're going to continue to get Deebo Samuel utilization, not only out wide as a wide receiver option, but as a running back, which will eventually lead to the touchdowns that he has missed thus far this season. Let's not forget, from weeks 10 through 18 of the 2021 season, he had scored 9 touchdowns in 8 games. I expect this offense to improve mightily. You got to remember, last week's game was Jimmy Garoppolo's probably first week of first team snaps all summer long, coming off the shoulder surgery from the offseason, all of that, culminating into a singular game. They're going to get better as the weeks progress. And this upcoming week, they take on the Los Angeles Rams. In the last 3 games that he's played against the Rams, he's averaged 24.19 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting Deebo Samuel to get back on track and be a guy that you should be investing in now before he has that breakout game, and you won't be able to trade for him in upcoming weeks. All right, let's go to move on to the next player. Another one of these top 12 players that has, as of thus far this season, underperformed, mainly because he missed last week's performance because he was suspended. He got kicked out and ejected of the week 2 game. And the only performance that we've seen from him is week 1, in which he actually had a great game against the Dallas Cowboys. He's currently the number 49 overall wide receiver. And if you have an ability to go ahead and trade for him, you should do so. Because just think about it. In the last 3 years, 2020 through 2022, when Tom Brady has been in the lineup and Mike Evans has been fully healthy, Mike Evans has averaged 14.41 half PPR fantasy points per game. When they're together, they are going to make a lot of success happen, and fantasy points are going to be there at a plenty. Now, just looking at the last couple seasons, the minimum statistics per year that Mike Evans has put forth is 109 targets, 70 receptions, 1,006 receiving yards, and 13 receiving touchdowns with Tom Brady 2020 and 2021. Those are the minimum statistics in all categories that he's put forth in terms of the wide receiver position. So as we approach the rest of the season, and we still have Julio Jones dealing with a PCL injury, with his current age and the fact that that knee injury is no joke, it could very easily hurt him all season long and potentially make him limited all season long. Chris Godwin still coming back from that hamstring injury, also while trying to recover from the ACL injury and still find some comfortability with that knee so he can push himself to the limits. If in fact those 2 wide receivers are going to be limited for the weeks ahead, I 100% expect Mike Evans to be the entire offense for this team. The running game has been, a shell of itself. The offensive line has been beat up. Leonard Fournette has been beat up. And going forward, Mike Evans is going to be the main part of this offense, and I can assure you that he is going to deliver for many of our fantasy teams. Moving on, let's talk about Keenan Allen, another one of these veteran wide receivers that as of thus far this season hasn't played much due to the injury that he sustained in week 1. That hamstring injury not only knocked him out of the week 1 contest, it held him out of week 2 because it was an early Thursday night contest. They didn't want to push themselves in week 3, which honestly, it was a good idea considering how that performance for the entire Chargers offense went as a whole. But going forward, we got to remember, similar to Mike Evans, the consistency that we've seen these kind of wide receivers show, these veteran wide receivers with their quarterbacks, it's irreplaceable. I mean, we're talking about Keenan Allen averaging 14.16 fantasy points per game with Justin Herbert under center since 2020. When they are together, they are producing incredible numbers when they're both healthy and active. Now, going into this upcoming weeks, it's still going to be a matter of how much are we going to see of Keenan Allen? Is he fully back? How is that rib injury potentially going to impact Justin Herbert going forward? Eventually, they're going to both be fully healed. And when they are, we're going to see Keenan Allen back to his full form of averaging double-digit fantasy points every single week. Let's not forget, in the last 27 full games that Herbert and Keenan Allen have played together, Keenan Allen has been targeted 10 or more times in 19 of those 27 games. I'm expecting a lot of passing from this Los Angeles Chargers offense, and Keenan Allen is going to be the main benefactor of that. Moving on, let's talk about some rookie wide receivers. Chris Olave is the first one that I wanted to mention. Even though Chris Olave is currently the number 24 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, this may be the final week that you may be able to go ahead and trade for him. Just looking at the last 2 weeks' performances of 13 targets in back-to-back weeks, I mean, that kind of opportunity alone is just, it's unbelievable. It's elite levels of opportunity that going forward, we're going to hopefully see more of. And the reason why I want to go ahead and go after Chris Olave is because when I look at the other receiving threats within this offense, Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, I absolutely could see these guys slowing down as the season progresses. And though they both had incredible performances in week 1, the last 2 weeks have really given us an indication as to where they want to go with the wide receiver position, throwing the ball deep and getting Chris Olave a lot of utilization. And the reason why they want to throw the ball deep for the majority of these games is because the New Orleans Saints do not score in the first 3 quarters. In fact, thus far this season, in the first 3 weeks, the New Orleans Saints have scored 38 of their 51 total offensive points in just the fourth quarter alone. That in itself is pretty concerning. This offense has struggled mightily, and what you typically that leads to in game scripts is, hey, we have to throw the ball deep. We have to get back into the game. We got to get a surge. We got to get some sort of momentum. So throughout the first 3, quarters, they're struggling, and then they begin to realize, man, we have to go ahead and we got to pick it up. And that's why majority of the targets that Chris Olave has received is a lot of deep targets down the field. I mean, as of thus far this season, Jameis Winston is the number 2 quarterback in terms of deep passing targets down the field, 20 or more yards. In 2019, when he was the full starter for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he led the quarterback position in that category with 99 deep passing attempts in that given year. This is the perfect time to get Chris Olave, put him on your roster before he starts scoring touchdowns and it gets completely out of hand when Michael Thomas or Jarvis Landry begin to miss time. And even if Jameis Winston misses time, let's not forget, Andy Dalton is the backup quarterback for this team. And we have a pretty good sample size of what Andy Dalton was able to do with Darnell Mooney last year. That could very easily be what Chris Olave turns into by the end of the 2022 year. All right, moving on to the final wide receiver I wanted to mention as a potential trade target for week 4. It is Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks is eventually going to be the number 1 wide receiver option for this team. It is going to take some time, but he is an investment for the future. They brought him in to replace A.J. Brown. They didn't bring in Robert Woods to do that. Robert Woods was brought in coming off of the ACL injury. I believe they traded, a 5th or 6th round pick for him. He is a veteran that is certainly going to be able to help the other receivers in this offense and serve as a veteran option that Ryan Tannehill can look for, but he's not going to be the number 1 going forward. It is going to be Treylon Burks because as we have seen thus far this season, the uptick of opportunity that we've seen for Treylon Burks in terms of snaps. He played 24 in week 1, 25 in week 2, and just this last week, career high, 40 snaps within the week, only 1 snap below Robert Woods on the totem pole. Played 70% of the offensive snaps just this past week against the Las Vegas Raiders. And though he wasn't able to get as many targets, we have already heard the offensive coordinator for this team, Todd Downing, come out and say, we have to get Treylon Burks more utilization within this offense. We are going to make a conscious effort to do so. And once offensive coordinators come out and say things like this, I'm expecting them to immediately show. Just like last week, we saw Matt LaFleur for the Green Bay Packers, their head coach, come out and say, we expect big things from Romeo Doubs in this week. Going forward, he should be a huge part of this offense. And what did we see? 8 targets, 8 catches, 78 yards and a touchdown, 88% of the offensive snaps. We are going to see numbers like this begin to creep in the right direction. It's not going to happen immediately for Treylon Burks, but you want to go ahead, have him on your roster, have him on your bench for when he does break out. This Titans offense, who is going to be a lot better than they have already shown this season, is going to have a lot of value for Treylon Burks. All right, now that we've covered these wide receiver trade targets, let's go ahead and talk about some players that you could potentially be selling high and getting off your roster in order to acquire players like this. Some running backs, some wide receivers. Let's talk about them. So we're talking about Clyde Edwards-Helaire first and foremost. Thus far this season, he's the number 4 overall running back in a half PPR scoring format. And I'm fairly confident in the idea that that's not going to persist. As of the first 3 weeks, he has split snaps with Jerick McKinnon 50-50. Not only that, he has seen himself 34 total opportunities while Jerick McKinnon has seen 22 in this backfield. Yes, Clyde Edwards-Helaire has been able to fall into the end zone, get himself a couple receptions, averaging about 4 receptions per week. But if in fact the numbers don't start to incline or stay as consistent in terms of the touchdown category, his fantasy value will crumble. And once it does, you're going to wish that you traded him many weeks ago. Now, the other player that I wanted to mention at the running back position, Antonio Gibson. So here's the thing about Antonio Gibson. Prior to the season starting, there was already a lot of information in regards to Brian Robinson Jr. out of Alabama being the primary first and second down running back. Now, many of us know that Brian Robinson was put on the injured reserve and he's going to be returning hopefully in week 5. And once he does, he should be able to once again reclaim that early down running work. And the reason why this concerns me in regards to Antonio Gibson is that as of the first 3 weeks, he's been the number 13 overall running back in fantasy football. He has scored himself a fair amount of touchdowns and gotten himself a lot of receiving work, but In terms of total snaps, he's played 123, while J.D. McKissic has played 106. If you go ahead and add another running back into the mix, and he begins to take a lot of the rushing work from the early downs, I can expect Antonio Gibson, J.D. McKissic, and Brian Robinson having a 33% split between the three of them and pretty much killing each other's value overall for the rest of the season. This is a team that likes to run the ball, but they're also throwing the ball 40 times per game. And the fact that J.D. McKissic has pretty much established himself as the third down running back as of the last 2 weeks leads me to believe that, Antonio Gibson's overall value going forward is going to diminish, which is why you want to trade him. So let's move on. Let's talk about Chase Edmonds. Chase Edmonds is not what I expected to see. Raheem Mostert is far too utilized in this offense, and it really does concern me to an extent to where Raheem Mostert, as of thus far this season, has 24 rushing attempts, while Chase Edmonds has 23. Raheem Mostert has 6 targets, while Chase Edmonds has 8. In terms of total running back opportunity, there's only one opportunity in the favor of Chase Edmonds over the first 3 weeks of the season. That in itself is extremely concerning because we thought Chase Edmonds was going to have this backfield to himself. And that very easily could be the case in future weeks. But as a running back who's coming off of a week where he scored 2 touchdowns, this is the perfect time to get him off your roster, sell high, because we cannot trust Miami Dolphins running backs at this time because this is a 50-50 split down the middle. And very easily, in a given week, we could see Raheem Mostert rushing in for those touchdowns and taking away value from Chase Edmonds. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position. I believe Marquise Brown is a potential player that we should be selling high, especially after what we saw this last week. 17 targets, 14 catches, 140 receiving yards, 28 fantasy points in a full PPR, 21 fantasy points in a half PPR. If you're able to go ahead and move on from him and get yourself elite level talent like I previously mentioned on today's video, potentially, a deal in which you can get Justin Jefferson, Mike Evans, Deebo Samuel onto your roster, you should do so. Because in a couple weeks, we're going to see DeAndre Hopkins return. And when he does, he is going to see a lot of targets go in his direction because Rondale Moore's beginning to get healthy. They've already said as an offense, Cliff Kingsbury come out and said they want to get more utilization for James Conner, whether it is on the ground or through the air. They're going to spread the ball out a lot within this offense. And that is the biggest concern for Marquise Brown. We drafted him knowing that for the first 6 weeks of the season, he was going to have a majority of this team's targets. 17 this last week is a lot, especially considering in weeks 1 and 2, his overall target count was 17 combined. I think the numbers are going to begin to kind of slide down in the direction of far less than 10 per week, especially once DeAndre Hopkins returns. And when that's going to be the case, I think this is a perfect time to sell high on Marquise Brown and get some extra value at another wide receiver position. Moving on to Michael Thomas. The issue I have with Michael Thomas is because I really do believe that Chris Olave is the real deal. I mentioned it before in regards to Chris Olave and why I feel so confident with him. This team has to throw the ball for majority of the second half. And Chris Olave has been that main guy because he has been the number one deep receiving threat for this offense. And if they're only scoring 38 of their 51 total points in the fourth quarter alone, as of thus far this season, what if those touchdowns just don't accumulate for Michael Thomas on a consistent basis? Yes, he scored 3 within the first 2 weeks. But if those touchdowns aren't there, and he's dealing with a foot injury, and that becomes an ankle injury, and that becomes something that could hold him out for multiple weeks, we have seen this already happen in the past. Michael Thomas has showed us what we could potentially expect to see in future weeks. And based on what I've seen already from this offense, I want to kind of move on from Michael Thomas. Take the value that he's already presented me and go ahead, trade him for another piece and gain value based on what he's already done. Moving on, let's talk about our final option is Devin Duvernay. Devin Duvernay may be on your bench, but truth be told, he's currently the number 17 overall wide receiver in fantasy football half PPR. He has scored 4 touchdowns in the first 3 games, one of those being a special teams touchdown, but he has only had 8 targets, 8 receptions, yet he has scored 3 receiving touchdowns. That rate of touchdowns is ridiculous, especially considering he's only playing 55% of the offensive snaps thus far this season. Those statistics alone make me want to go ahead, grab Devin Duvernay, and absolutely move him as soon as I possibly can. Move him because we know that Rashad Bateman and Mark Andrews are going to be the number 1 and number 2 option. And if Lamar Jackson is going to be running for as many yards as he has in the last couple weeks, we can purely anticipate that the passing game for a number 2 receiving option, number 3 receiving option within this offense isn't going to be that promising. Move them off your roster as quickly as you possibly can. All right, that's going to cover the trade them now players, guys that you should be getting off your roster at this current moment in time, trying to sell high on them if you possibly can. That's going to conclude today's video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel with your viewership, clicking the like button, of course, using the promo code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. Again, for those of you who are trying to participate in tonight's Pick'ems contest, go ahead and do so by clicking on the link down in the description of the video, traveling to their website using promo code Andrew, and when you make a first-time deposit using the promo code, you'll be giving a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out today. After today's Thursday night football game between the Cincinnati Bengals and Miami Dolphins, I will be live streaming here on the channel. So for those of you who have made it to the end of the episode, hopefully I'll see you later tonight. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.